Good morning. It's great to see all of you here, and welcome to everyone who is joining us online, which we know continues to be more and more folks. We're so glad that you have continued to connect. I'll tell you, I don't know if y'all realize this, there's 5 days till Christmas. Y'all know that? So I'm done. I've got all my gifts done. My house is decorated. Just by way of counting things down, this is the last Sunday that we will gather in this capacity for 2020. So 2020 is coming to a close. Deep breath. This is week 41 of the COVID chaos that we have been in. Week 41 weeks. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of difficult things that have happened. We all know that. Everybody has a story. If it's not your own story, it's someone that you know who has been disrupted, who has been harmed, who has been hurt through some implications of this season. So we recognize that. I will tell you, there's also been some beautiful things that have happened. We started off this in March, and I went back through my notes, the things that we taught, the things that we said, and we started talking about hope in the dark, that's something that's available to us when we cannot see ahead, we cannot understand why things are happening, or we don't really understand or have any clue of how they're going to turn out. And we talked about Romans 8, which says that all creation is groaning. It is in this groaning, in this futility, that is longing for some redemption, for some purpose. I think that's a fitting metaphor, fitting assessment of the condition of our culture and the things that we are dealing with. But we also said this, we talked about hope in the dark, something that's available to us, something that is actually available, that has the capacity to sustain and to move us through. And we said that hope looks like patience. That's how we started this in March. Hope looks like patience. I assume most of you are tired of dealing with coronavirus, of dealing with the implications, of dealing with the disrupted Christmas plans, all that. We're all tired of it. Everybody's tired of it. There's no one that I know that is not. But we talked about the fact that if we can hold on to something, if there's something underneath us, underneath our feet, that allows us to live differently, right? Hope staves off being annoyed all the time. It's what keeps us from getting annoyed with one another. It's what keeps us from getting annoyed with all the things, all the things that happen, all the things we have to deal with. And it also undermines anxiety. It doesn't allow us, our emotions, our hearts to sort of get undermined and become anxious and fearful and live in that place. And this is really what I want for us to do, because there's actually some things that I'm extraordinarily excited about and what's happened. This week particularly, I could go back for weeks and weeks, but this week particularly has been a lot of hard news for a lot of families who are part of our church, people I know well. Things have happened, and it's just been really like kind of gut punches on top of everything else. And we've known people who, a lot of the efforts that we've made, a lot of our partners that deal with folks who are most vulnerable, whether it be poverty or children or hungry and those things, what I have seen is our church. And one of the things that I've always been, hesitant about, or at least sort of underneath, when you have a big church and a large organization, is how nimble can we be? How responsive can we be? And the reality is through this season, we have been unbelievably nimble and responsive. And I've seen people come out of the woodwork. I've seen people walk with people through devastating loss and just lift and bring a little bit of shouldering and hope to folks. And it's happened thousands and thousands and thousands of times throughout the life of our church. I saw it happen again this week. People reaching out to others in a very personal way to say, hey, we're in this together. We're going to shoulder this together. We're going to walk through this together. I can't change this. I can't solve this. I can't fix this. But what I can do is I can be with you and we can be together. That's what the church does, and this is what it brings. And part of the reason I've wanted to focus on joy for this whole season is not just to do the hope, joy, peace thing, but to really kind of mine out joy. I want to squeeze it to understand what it means for us. We can find it. And the result of joy that is set before us, that's what we're talking about, the result of this joy that is set before us, a hope that is sufficient for us to continue, And it isn't about how things turn out. This is where the way of Jesus is so radically different, and what we've been invited into is so radically different. It's not based on how this turns out. It's not based on whether this works out well or doesn't work out well. It's how you lived and how you responded and how you treated other people before you knew what the outcome was going to be. And I want you to pay really close attention to this, because this is what I've said. People say, Mike, what do you want for our church? I'll tell you what I want. I told you before the election. I told you before coronavirus. What I wanted is to lead our church so that we don't lose our minds and our hearts and our witness just because things are hard. The story that you will tell at the end of this, what you will say about 2020, will largely rest on what you do in the meantime, in these days and weeks and seasons until we get to the end. Y'all know I'm a big believer in finishing well, finishing years well. I'm about to pick my 15th word this year. If you don't know what that is, you need to go check out my one word or anything we've done for a long time. We pick words around here. 15 words I'm about to pick. I can see this incredible arc of God's work in my life. Richie and I were just talking about this back in my office, about how his words have been shaping him. And he's like, man, I need to get better. I'm like, no, Richie, I can see this in you. I know what his words are. I can see this in you, and I get to encourage him in that. This end of this year is a place for us to finish well. Ecclesiastes 7 says, the better is the end of a thing than its beginning. And that may be your favorite verse for 2020, right? Better is the end of 2020 than its beginning. And what a lot of us are going to think is that better is the end of a thing because it's over and we made it through and it's finished and it's behind us. But that's not why something is better at the end. The reason the end of a thing is better than its beginning is because the thing actually matters and it has purpose. And you won't find this by simply running on into 2021. In fact, more than likely, you'll get more and more frustrated if you're not really careful in what you do in the next 14 days. Because 2021 is going to start exactly the way 2020 ended. There's not much going to be different. And you've got to have different perspective and fresh energy to enter back into these circumstances with a measure of hope, and more importantly, to actually encounter this idea of joy. You realize that when I begin to squeeze and kind of focus on joy, what I realize is that joy actually serves as sort of a counter emotion to all the other valid emotions that rise. And it's actually a fruit of the Spirit, which means it comes from us abiding and remaining in Christ. This is what Dennis read, right? If you remain in me and I'll remain in you, remain in my love. I've told you these things, Jesus said, so that my joy will be in you and your joy will be made complete. A lot of us have understanding joy, and I want to talk today and kind of wrap this year up by talking about what is the result of joy? What happens when you experience joy? We got a picture of this last week, and Carson and I talked about this in a little video we did posted this week, kind of mine this out a little bit deeper. But my daughter is married to Carson. Carson and Maddie have a lab, a yellow lab, who is crazy. His name is Baxter. I've shown you pictures of him before. Baxter is the king of the side eye. Like if you call him, he won't look at you directly. He just kind of hits you up with the side eye. It's like, what do you want? Are you going to give me something? And he loves, but he's so fun. So the other night, we were out and running some errands, and we decided that we were going to take Madison and Carson some ice cream and bring them ice cream. And just because we were out and about, we were bringing them ice cream. And so I knew Baxter was going to be at the house. So I brought Baxter some of his favorite treats. He likes greenies. And greenies, these little green expensive, they're really ridiculously expensive. And bring them over there, and he got to the door, and I just held them up for him. And they were like, oh, Mike, he's so, Dad, he's so glad to see you. I'm like, no, he's not glad to see me, because he is like bouncing up and down. That's what he does, like a pogo stick. He's not glad to see me. He is glad to see me because I am the delivery mechanism for that which he wants. And what a lot of us is, this is the way we sort of process joy. We've never really learned how to find joy in a relationship. We learn to find joy and enjoyment in someone being the delivery mechanism of what we want, including God. If you read the Bible, what you find in the scriptures from the very beginning in Genesis, God's promise to Abraham when he's going to send him I've got a land prepared for you. You know what he says? He says, Abraham, I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people, and I will be your very great reward. We don't ever really learn that. We think, oh, the promised land's the reward, the blessing's the reward, the this is the reward. When God fixes that, that's the reward. And he says, no, I'm the one who's sufficient for you. This is what's echoed in Jesus. When Jesus says, if you remain in me and you remain in my love, you will have my joy, and in that your joy will be made complete. These are things that you've got to figure out how to get your head and your heart around in order to understand this. And what we've been talking about is these four kind of things through this as we talk about joy. And the way I write this down, this is what I did in my journal. Week one, we talked about this, that joy is pervasive so that it's not circumstantial. And so what I do is I sit down and I just kind of make this list that joy has to be pervasive, has to be able to touch everything that I'm experiencing, or it's probably going to rest on my circumstances. It's only going to be, God's only going to be the delivery system. If I get the greenies, I'm happy. If I don't, I'm mad. If things go well, I'm happy. If things don't go well, I'm mad. So joy has to be pervasive. It has to reach into those places. The second thing is, and we talked about this when we talked with Ryler and his story, is that joy has the capacity to shape. That joy is formative. It's a counter emotion so that it doesn't become subjective. Joy has to be more powerful than that for you to find it. And I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to share kind of personally how you can find this in just a few minutes. I just want you've got to, we can't rush past this. And last week we talked about the fact that there's a sufficiency to joy that doesn't require anything else. And this is so that we don't become graspy. There's a lot of graspy people. And if you missed that, you need to go back and check that one out last week. I don't have any more time to talk about that. And today, I want to talk about the result of joy. What is joy? What does it look like when you find it in your life? And the way I'm thinking about this is I want to understand joy is expressive, so that you and I don't become cynical. Anybody grown cynical? Anybody have friends that have grown cynical? You can just see it happening. You start making decisions on things that they should not dictate how you make decisions. We've given so much credibility to politics and so much authority to our circumstances. And we just grow more and more and more hardened and more and more and more cynical. This is why we've defined joy like this. Joy is defined as a resulting emotion. It is an emotion. It's more than that, but it is an emotion of being loved by God. We talked about this last week, to stop and to wonder. To stop and to see. Last week, Sunday night, I got a text about 8 o'clock informing me that the Gemini meteor shower was passing over the earth. I don't know if any of you guys saw that. You're like, I'm too busy, I'm too tired. I know, I was too. I was like, you know what? I'm going to go out there and I'm going to watch for it. I sat on my back porch, went to the beach, and sat on my back porch in a lawn chair and just looked at the sky. You go, phew, and you just see this little, whoa. And my daughter kept saying, you got to come here and see this, Michaela. And we're out there looking. Phew. And you're just like, these things are flying by at 78,000 miles per hour. You just have to let your mind kind of wonder, right? It's a resulting emotion of seeing and being loved and pondering and thinking about how great and how good God's love is towards you and towards me. And then it adds this, but I want us to learn joy in such a way that it drives and defines everything else. The way the Bible talks about this, it says that our lives, the way we sort of live, are to be to the praise of God's glory. That people should see us and be able to see something about the God that we love and serve and that loves us. That's the picture we get. And so here's the challenge. And this is where you have to test yourself. The promise of available joy, that God has said there's a joy that is available to you that does not rest on your circumstances. The only way that is tested is when you can't depend on your circumstances. The only way I can test Baxter's joy for me is if I show up without greenies. You know what happens if I show up without greenies? I get the side eye. Because the only way we do this as humans is that when things don't work out like you hoped they would, like you thought they would, when disappointment is real, is a real threat, how do you respond? When you can't trust in your circumstances to bring you joy, that's the only place that you can begin to find a more sufficient joy, a more pervasive joy, a more formative joy, and ultimately a joy that actually does what you hoped it would do. I want to read a couple of passages to you to see this, to understand this, to think about this. Habakkuk chapter 3. This is the Old Testament prophets, and this isn't inconsistent with the way God reveals himself to us. The fact that we're at Christmas isn't lost on the fact there were 400 years of longing and waiting, 400 years of longing and waiting for God to come and rescue and to deliver and to do what he had promised to do. We don't like to wait 40 minutes, let alone 40 days or 40 years, and certainly not 400 years. I think one of the plagues of our culture is we have lost a generational responsibility. If it doesn't happen today or tomorrow, the next day, we have no interest in it. When some of the things that we do actually have implications 100 years from now. Where my life is directed now at the age of 50, I'm looking at the next 10 years. My concern is for what happens to the folks who are in their 20s today and how they take this thing that God has done here and take it into wherever God wants it to go. It's generational. It's future. It's always been that way. The way God's promises and his glory gets revealed is from generation to generation. We need a vision for that. And most of us are so impatient with what's right in front of us. We have no capacity to understand the implications of something 5 years from now or 10 years from now or 40 years from now, let alone 100 years from now. But this is really what's at stake. If you want to find and learn how to be alive as a human being, that isn't just bouncing from greenie to greenie to greenie, or whoever happens to give you what you want in the moment. There's a much more foundational, much more sufficient, much more stable way we've been invited to live in. And this is how Habakkuk writes this. I want you to listen to this. He says, though the fig tree does not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food. The flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls. This is a bad day. This is a bad season. Though this relationship didn't turn out, though I don't have enough money in the bank, though I don't have these things, though this job, though this deal, though this, whatever it might be, just fill in the blank for whatever. We don't have fig trees and fields and herds and stalls, but whatever you have that hasn't come to fruition. Though these things have all happened, listen to verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. It's sort of a dogged determination. For me, what I have to do, because there are so many things that happen seemingly all at the same time. Learning to find a way forward. Learning to deal with the news of someone who's been waiting for God to come through, and he comes through, and then news of someone who is hoping that God would do something, and it didn't turn out that way, and it happens all in the same time. And to be able to celebrate and to mourn, to feel joy and to feel gladness, the thing that tends to happen to us in those moments when we feel that tension all the time is we just shut down, lock our heads down, and go forward. My word this year has been avail. To avail myself, which I thought was like really more of a just being available to people, and it really turned into being willing to open myself up, to be able to see things. And what I've found is, and I'm learning this, I'm still on the front end of this because I live with joy, so I get this all the time. Mike, I can get cynical, I can get skeptical about people and their problems, and I have to be reminded. And the idea of compassion simply means to suffer with. You don't do that sitting on the couch watching the news and bemoaning all of the ills of the world. You develop compassion by walking to someone who is in suffering, and you walk with them, and you share and you feel suffering with them. To suffer with. To veil has meant to get my eyes open, to say, God, there are things, and then you have to back in and say, okay, how am I going to process this so that I don't just become hard and numb and uncaring? Or worse, sit back at a distance and just lob cool, trite statements to everybody about how everybody should be doing this better, but actually to live out, this is the story that I'm going to be telling. And one of my go-tos over the years that really saved me probably 10 or 15 years ago was in the middle of all this, the way I processed things was just to lock in and to not feel. I was still passionate and still all excitement, all those things, but I knew that there was something happening in my heart and in my soul. Because I couldn't take all the various emotions that all the various circumstances and responsibilities required from me. So the protective mechanism is just lock it up, focus, and then go. And some of that's where you are. You haven't been moved in a long time. You've been moved by fear, but you haven't been moved by compassion. You haven't been inspired to give yourself, to let people see something in you. And so here's what Lamentations says, and it's interesting. This is written by Jeremiah, who's known as the weeping prophet. Jeremiah was just beat his head against the wall most of his prophetic time, trying to get people to listen to him. Then he laments the condition of what's happening. And here's how he talks about how he continues. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 18. So I say, my splendor is gone and all that I had hoped from the Lord. Like this is a posture of like, oh my gosh, everything that I thought was going to be didn't turn out. Everything I hoped God would do, he didn't do. I remember my affliction and my wandering and my bitterness and my unmitigated gall if you've watched The Grinch. He says, I remember them well, and my soul is downcast within me. He's tired. He's alone. And just, he feels it. Yet, here it is again, right? Yet I will rejoice in Habakkuk, and here it is again in Lamentations. Yet I will call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. What does he recall to mind? Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions, his hesed, his love for us never fails. These mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. So I will say to myself, the Lord is my portion. What that literally means is the Lord is enough. He's enough. Therefore, I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him and to those who seek him. So I began to think about this, is how does this hope produce joy? Like, how do I find this personally? I'm an emotional guy. It's important. I think emotions are important. So what I would do is I would sit down, and this is honestly why my time with God, my quiet time, my devotion time, whatever you call it, has become unbelievably important to me. And I cannot overstate it. Time with God in the morning, there's no substitute for it. I grew up with the adage, if you're too busy to spend time with God, you're busier than he intends for you to be. So I've just, for decades, have just carved out, and just made it. It's just not something I compromise on. And has nothing to do with the message, but I'll tell you what's really interesting. It only took me about 15 years to develop it as a discipline. So if you've only been doing it for 7 or 8 years and it still feels like drudgery, welcome to the club. You only got about 8 more years and it'll be like, you're like, I can't believe I can't miss this. 15 years. If you're better than me, then maybe you've developed that faster. But for me, it took about 15 years. But I'll tell you what I've learned is that I do my quiet time. I do that as though my life depends on it because it does. I know what kind of person I am and will be without remaining in Christ. I know that person is there. God has changed me in some incredible ways, but it's become so important for me. What I find in that, a lot of times when I'm overwhelmed or in these seasons, what this verse sustained me in, especially through a lot of struggles that I had early on, whether it was struggles in my head or struggles in my heart, was that God's mercies are new every morning. That I could wake up every morning and meet him and say, God, today, whatever happened yesterday, today your mercies are new. Great is your faithfulness towards me. And what I learned in that is that God's faithfulness towards me was my call to simply be faithful to him in the moment. What he was asking of me is not to do more than I was doing or to make things turn out differently. He was asking me to, Mike, will you be faithful and will you trust me in this moment? Do you know how you get to tell stories about God's faithfulness? Is by walking in faithfulness with him. There is no shortcut. Everybody wants a sensational story. Everybody wants to do some big thing. It is literally walking with him, step by step, moment by moment, day after day, year after year. My mantra since I was about 25 years old has been, my life, I want it to be marked by a long obedience in the same direction. And that's what I've pursued. Very few things have been these sensational moments in my life. It's just a long, steady slog. It is all I can do not to address the rain. So those of you who are watching, you're like, what is happening? This is a new level of focus for me. But here's why. So what I do is I recognize, when I recall his love for me and I recognize his faithfulness and I say, God, I just have to be faithful in this moment. And what I realize is there's sufficient grace for it. And sometimes what I realize is I haven't been faithful in the moments. You know what I realize in those moments also? There's sufficient grace for that. Do you get that? A lot of us have these two categories. One is we walk by faith and grace, and the other is we blew it, we messed up, and we got to earn something back. And both of them, it's the wrong categories. It's not to be flippant, it's just to understand that God's love for you actually has a formative power. There's a shaping nature to it. And what I find in that is a measure of hope. God, I think I can be faithful in this moment. And I find in there a measure of peace that somehow things are going to work out and they're going to be okay. And those two things are really important, but I have to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze because what happens is there's this inkling of joy. I begin to feel something. There's an emotion that makes me smile or chuckle or whatever that thing is. I don't know if you've ever pressed or stayed there that long. Maybe you turn on music or maybe you write something that just kind of expresses this idea. And this is why this is so important. And I remember reading this years ago, a book by C.S. Lewis called The Weight of Glory. And he talks about this idea of what happens when we enjoy something. How do you know when you enjoy something? How do you know when you find joy? What is it measured by? You know what's measured. You know how you measure cynicism, right? You want to know if you're a cynical person? You measure by how much you complain. If you complain, you're cynical. So how do you measure joy? How do you tell if joy is starting to bubble up in there? C.S. Lewis wrote this, and this is written, decades ago, a little bit kind of old style, but just it's so beautifully written. C.S. Lewis, he talks about the fact that God says, praise me, like he reads the Psalms as though they're God's words, praise me, praise me. And he says, it sounds like an old woman seeking a compliment. Like God's like, do I look okay? Can you just give me some praise? And then he says this, but the strange and most obvious fact about praise, it's from his book on praise. The most obvious fact about praise, whether of God or anything, has strangely escaped me. I thought of it in terms of compliment or approval or the giving of honor, but I had never noticed that enjoyment spontaneously overflows into praise. Did you see that? The world rings with praise. Lovers praising their mistresses, readers their favorite poets, walkers praising the countryside, players praising their favorite games. I think we delight to praise in what we enjoy because the praise not merely expresses, but it completes the enjoyment. It is its appointed consummation. You want to know why this is important? Because joy is measured, it is expressed, and it is awakened in praise. How much comes out of you that brings that to other people? But I begin to think about this, that joy gets measured, right, in our praise. It's the enjoyment that is expressed in a moment, even if only for a moment. Sometimes it's just a breath that you get, but it's there. When you learn how to see that and trust that, you begin to see what Jesus was talking about, that his joy is in us, and there's a fullness of it. And it's also our willingness to stay in and to tell the story of God's faithfulness in the future. And everybody wants to tell stories. Everybody loves to tell stories of faith. But the only way you tell stories of faith is from the future. It's the only way it happens. Though the fig tree does not blossom, nor is there fruit on the vines, the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food. The flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will take joy in the God of my salvation. The thing that I've been learning about the promises of Scripture over the last 5-6 years more than anything else is this promise of redemption. There is nowhere where he promises that our circumstances will work out. It's just not there. He does promise that he will redeem all things. He will take that which was intended to undermine and to destroy and to harm and to take life, and he will use it to bring you life. He promised that. But redemption requires this stubborn belief that God uses everything. He uses everything. I know some of you are here. You have stories where there were things that you went through 5, 6, 10, 20 years ago that were devastating. And you tell those stories on this end of God's faithfulness to you. Circumstances did not turn out like you wanted, but you tell those stories of God's faithfulness in you and to you. And that your heart was awakened and your heart came alive and it didn't harden and grow cynical. And that somehow you even begin to see more and more of God's purposes and his love and his care and his goodness for you in ways that you would have never written for yourself. But you can attest that they're beautiful nonetheless. What I want for us to be really careful of and to test ourselves in, and the way I wrote this down is that the struggles that we face today will be the stories of redemption that we tell tomorrow. But it will not happen apart from faithfulness in this moment and the next. It just will not happen without faithfulness in this moment. And the thing that you can bank on is that his mercies are new and available every single new day and new moment we face, and that he is faithful, and that your faith is not trying to prove or to draw his faithfulness. Your faith actually rests on his. If you can find this, right, you can find joy. Some of you have already written the story of how this is going to turn out differently, right? You're like, oh, this is going to turn out differently because. And you're basing your trust and your hope that this is going to be fine. That's not the story that he's asking you to tell. That's not the story you're wanting to tell. Doesn't mean we don't ask for him or pray for him. It's just there's so much more that's available to us. So what I want us to do as we close, and I'll tell you how we're gonna do this, because I really believe these next 11 days are incredibly important for you, and because they're important to you, they're important for us. But I want us to just sit in this moment and just kind of let the words of this song kind of wash over us. It just says that it's hard to see sometimes from where we are. But there is a story. There is a story that you will tell. There is a story that you will tell. And that story has the power to be beautiful and redemptive in ways that you cannot fathom from where you are. So don't try. You just resolve. God, I know you use everything. So I'm going to rejoice in the Lord. I'm going to take joy in the God of my salvation. That is a joy that cannot be taken away. Father, I ask that you would meet us in this moment. We have 11 days left until 2020 is over, and we've been talking about this since July, maybe earlier. Father, our hope does not rest in 2020 being over. Our hope does not even rest in the end of a pandemic, although we long for that. Our hope rests in you, and that is a foundation that nothing can shake. God, give us the faith in this moment to rest on that we would find a sense of peace that transcends our understanding, that we would find a measure of hope and confidence that things will be okay. God, more than that, would you awaken joy in us? So God, just speak to us in these moments, and I'll lift this in the name of your Son, Jesus.